Tātad man ir tas gods.
I have the honor to moderate the first plenary session. We have honorable guests, the experts of this field. The first speaker will be Jan Jařab. He represents Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights in Europe. And he worked in the office of Commissioner Spiegel at the time when they were working on deinstitutionalization and develop guidelines that we are trying to implement now. Please, the floor is yours.
Morning. Ladies and gentlemen, it is a great pleasure and a great honor to be here with you today, and I would like to thank the Latvian Presidency for inviting me, and above all for choosing this issue as a theme of this presidency event, and I hope that following presidencies will continue in its footsteps. I would also like to appreciate the fact that Latvia has embarked on reform in its own domestic services. I want to start by saying that we at the UN Human Rights Office are very committed to this issue, and we very strongly support the European Union and member states' efforts in reforming services for children and for persons with disabilities. We've been supporting this since the establishment of our regional office for Europe in 2009, and we are part of the European Expert Group on transition from institutional to community-based care. And we are enthusiasts. I didn't have my earphones on when being introduced, so I didn't quite understand everything, but I heard the word enthusiast, and I can assure you that we are enthusiasts of this process. Now, why are we enthusiasts of this process? Because also we realize that we as the human rights community have been slow in the past. We have been slow to recognize that also rights of persons with disabilities, rights of children who are in institutions, that they should be part of our focus. And we have come to that understanding, and we have come to the understanding that when the Universal Declaration of Human Rights says that everyone has a particular right, it actually means everyone. It doesn't mean everyone except those forgotten people out there in institutions. And one of our roles here since the outset was to try to tie the emancipation narratives together. We know that they have been going on for some time, 4 different, sometimes you could say 5 different emancipation narratives for persons with disabilities, more specifically than the mental health area, persons with psychosocial disabilities, children, older persons, and that there are common denominators. Of course, they are not the same, but there are common denominators in the human rights challenges posed by the institutional culture and the institutional model. Now, I'm sure you're familiar with the international standards that apply here, but representing the UN, I have to start from them and mention at least the 3 key instruments we are referring to here. It's the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, then specified with the UN guidelines for the alternative care of children, which are a form of soft law but much more focused on alternative care, then the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And here I would say, of course, we have all heard about the convention, we have discussed it. One thing that needs to be, however, emphasized is that this is a very, very modern instrument. It is an instrument that really represents a change of perspective. I'm sure that if a convention on the rights of persons with disabilities had been adopted in the 1970s or 80s, it would have still been very medical, very paternalistic. The fact that we have it from the beginning of the 21st century is the reason why it has this focus on choice, on autonomy, on people as rights holders. And of course, Article 19, the one that we are discussing here, the one that's the basis of our efforts for deinstitutionalization, it doesn't really speak of institutions. It speaks about the opportunity to choose. It speaks about the availability of specific services in the community, including personal assistance, and it speaks about the availability of those services which are there for the general population. Professor Gerard Quinn from Ireland, from the National University of Ireland in Galway, often says that this article is in a way a kind of a gateway article to many others, to the enjoyment of many other rights in the Convention, because without it, without having the possibility to live independently and be included in a community, it's very difficult to enjoy some of the other rights. Now, when we come to children, the guidelines that I mentioned on alternative care for children tell us something that my honored colleague and friend Iri Schwarz mentioned already earlier, that the Commission has taken over in its recommendation, namely that poverty should not be a reason to place children in institutions. Indeed, it should not be a reason to separate children from their families in the first place. The effort has to be to support families, to avoid separation. But if separation is necessary, then children should be placed in family-type care. When we start from the institutional model, we should be fair to it. The institutional model didn't come across because people wished something bad to happen. It came across as an expression of, it came into existence as an expression of a early modern view, paradigm of progress, which was based on something that is progressive, even today, that is the recognition that everybody has needs, but these were defined more as material needs. The recognition of responsibility of public authorities to do something about it, to avoid that people are destitute in the streets. It was very much based on the belief that science and modern organizations can solve problems by putting them in boxes and removing those boxes out of the mainstream of society and dealing with them separately. It was only gradually that it was recognized that it is actually an inherent human rights challenge, that there are risks involved in institutional care, that people will not be able to, for instance, enjoy their legal capacity, that they will have lack of autonomy, that their personal will and preferences will not be taken into account, that their right to family life won't be enjoyed, and that children will not have their best interests respected. And that there is a risk of abuse. Of course, there are also risks of abuse in community care and in families, but there are specific risks for abuse in institutional care, which are somehow linked to the very character of institutional care, to the broader cultural patterns in a given society, to paternalism, but also to rigid institutional culture, often to a lack of control mechanisms. It's been often observed that there is less control in care institutions than in prisons. Isolation from outside world, very often they are in remote location, and we see that lots of the risks are associated with staff shortages, lack of appropriate qualification of staff, and with the whole culture of just warehousing people. There are individual risks as well, but we should be careful not to ascribe all of the problems just to flaws of individuals, because many of them are indeed systemic. So we're basically trying to move from objective needs to subjective rights, from paternalistic to interactive ethics, and beyond material conditions also to non-material aspects such as autonomy and choice. We are trying to move away from a classical modernist paradigm without losing the positive sides of that classical modernist paradigm. So let's reiterate, states shouldn't just thrust the responsibility back on families. They have to continue providing for needs, including material needs, but from the perspective of rights of individuals as right holders. Yes, they should maintain their responsibilities of public authorities, but at the same time empower service users themselves, their families and communities, and work closely with civil society. And while science is important, it can never be the only thing. It has to be subordinated to humanistic principles. We have opportunities. We have the European structural investment funds, as was detailed in the previous presentation. We have the commitment and support of the European Commission, and I'm very thankful to Jyri Schwarz and other colleagues from the Commission who have shown that support consistently over years. And it is also very promising that there are processes underway in EU member states which provide an opportunity for shared learning, both of what went well and in some cases of what went less well. Obviously, the CRPD, which has been ratified by all but 3 of the member states and by the EU itself, provides also an impetus for synergies and harmonized implementation. What are the risks? A first type of risk is that a lot will be invested in alternatives that are somewhat better than the existing ones, but not sufficiently different. And that often happens when there is a very strong, entrenched lobby of very conservative directors of institutions and other service providers who are intent on spending a lot on just making the institutions a little bit better, or building new ones which will be somewhat smaller, or which will look like being in the community but still being very clustered and still maintaining a institutional mode of thinking. And though this can represent a certain degree of improvement, research shows that the improvement is rather small and the investment rather high. And then it becomes difficult to reform such a semi-reform structure again. So it may actually mean a lost opportunity. Very interesting research comes from the United States of America in this regard, because they have mapped the development since the 1970s, and it is the Center for Outcome Analysis, if you're interested. It shows that overall the process of deinstitutionalization of services for persons with disabilities was a success from Maine to California, but that a real change, a real tangible change in quality of life came above all for persons who were moved to live individually or in very small group facilities of up to 4 to 6 persons. So when we see states planning that they will replace institutions for 500 people by institutions for 45 or 60 people, or even 15, we are worried, because we think this is not actually it's not a qualitative jump, it's a quantitative one, but it's not a qualitative jump that we would have wished for. The second type of risk is that sometimes it's only deinstitutionalization in the narrow sense of the word, that is just about closing something. And we always have to remember that if we use the word deinstitutionalization, we mean both closing something and creating something new. That's why we prefer to say the longer transition from institutional to community-based care. It's not just about closing and leaving people to fend for themselves or idealizing the old-fashioned family model that we return children or persons with disabilities to the care of their families. There is no way of returning to the 19th century. We don't want to return to the 19th century where women were not in the labor market and it was the role of women to take care of children and persons with disabilities. It has to be a role of the public sphere to create these services in the community. We need personal assistance, we need individual budgets, we need all this dense network of services that will make life in the community possible. And of course, as Jiří had said, we need to invest above all into prevention and gatekeeping so that the need doesn't even arise, or the risk of being institutionalized doesn't even arise or can be avoided. And finally, I should mention number three, two contemporary emerging risks that we have become aware of. One is that we see a development towards for-profit care services, both institutional and non-institutional, with a fully commercial logic, and somehow the state's saying, well, it's no longer our responsibility, we have privatized it. So we here as the UN have to say with all seriousness, no, you can actually privatize, you can have for-profit services, but the state remains responsible and accountable, and the quality must be just as when it's provided by any other type of service provider. And the other one, of course, which was also evoked, is the impact of austerity, which in some cases has created a setback because the more modern, softer, more person-centered services were easier to cut than the old-fashioned big institutions. Or, as we saw in Greece, we saw closure of institutions continuing, while at the same time, due to austerity, the community-based services were cut. That is, of course, wrong. I have two sets of recommendations. First is that, of course, the structural funds can help us bridging when there are the extra investments which need to be made in the phase of reform, when the old services are being gradually phased out, but new ones have to come in. That's a great opportunity to use the structural funds. We believe in our office very strongly in bridge building between the human rights expertise and the social and health policies expertise, and it's continuing, and the more the better. And of course we believe very much in involving all groups of rights holders. None of them should be forgotten, and there needs to be cooperation across sectors. We promote the recommendations of the international human rights mechanism, so please, you'll find a lot of inspiration, for instance, in the CRPD committee's concluding observations to those states that have been reviewed already, and the toolkit and guidelines on transition from institutional to community-based care. Here we thank very much the European Commission for having been such a staunch supporter of the guidelines and toolkit. And I would, of course, end up by thanking the Latvian Presidency for choosing this theme and all of you for your kind attention.
Liels paldies Jařaba kungam, un es domāju, ka tieši
Thank you very much, Mr. Jařab. I believe that your presentation will be a very good foundation to refer to. Very often we are short of argumentation, and here all the arguments were given, and we heard all of them, and we shall be able to make use of them. And I would like to give the floor to Ms. Donata Vivante, a very active person in the area of support of human rights, and she was head of the Autism Society in Europe, and her contribution is huge. And now over to you.
Yes, it should. Thank you very much for inviting me in representing the European Disability Forum, which is an umbrella organization putting together the national councils from the EU countries and behind the EU, and the most important European networks on specific disabilities. So representing in this way the disability community of Europe, that means 80 million people with disabilities. I am very grateful to the Latvian Presidency for its commitment in the field of disabilities and for raising this issue of institutionalization and deinstitutionalization, which is a real challenge today. And I would like to introduce you the perspective of the European Disability Forum on this issue. First of all, what we are speaking about 1 million human beings with disabilities, children and adults, that live in large-scale institutions or in the backrooms of their family homes. This happens where the institutionalization, as it has been told, is intended as putting persons out of services. This, of course, is not the case. This is not the process of the institutionalization, because persons are in this kind of facilities cut off from their communities and assisted according to a charity, protection, and medical models that are not compliant with the UN Convention, often against their will or against the will of their families, stripped of their dignity, freedom, and human rights without knowing why and how long. So they are really condemned to prison without having any responsibility and without real alternatives and hope for change. So we wonder, how can we tolerate this situation and how these persons could develop their human potential. As I told, when we speak about residential care facilities, we are not referring only to large-scale structures, but also we are referring to the person, mainly to the person, not to the structure. So these are any place where persons are compelled to live together and do not have control over their lives and over the decision concerning their lives, and where the requirements of the organization of the structure take precedence over residents' individual needs. Generally, more a person needs support, more our society asks to this person to adapt to confectioned facilities that are not really tailored on their needs. Maybe at the beginning they have been thought to be tailored on a general need of this population, but then they become the driver of the organization and not the needs of the person. So in some way, the institutionalization cannot be meant as that all people to be put in the society without a support. The institutionalization means focusing on the person and on his needs and making services to go to the person, not the person to go to the services. And as it has been told, of course, the needs of persons are different, but as we will see, Article 19 perfectly deals with the different situations of different persons with disabilities. So far, we do not have seen extensive institutionalization programs to be implemented in EU countries, though some very good examples exist and have been mentioned and will be further mentioned in these days. And it has just been mentioned the effects of the economic crisis and indiscriminate cuts to social funds in the EU countries that are not only delaying the deinstitutionalization programs, but also triggering a trend towards the re-institutionalization in some countries. And this is also the consequence of a prejudice, I think, because there are no demonstration that institutional care is less expensive than community-based care, mainly in the long term, if we consider that an institutionalized person will not develop his or her potential and will remain more and more dependent during his or her life. So it will cost even more, even if we should never evaluate the institutionalization process as in terms of costs, but in terms of rights of the person, according to the Article 19 of the UNCRPD. It is why the Article 19 of CRPD is at the center of the goals of the disability movement, and we should not forget that it is strictly linked with other articles of the UN Convention and to the exercise of other fundamental rights, such as liberty, freedom from constriction, and degrading treatment. So deinstitutionalization is not only a question of compliance with Article 19, but of a compliance of a range of articles of the UN Convention. So Article 19 deals not only with the right to full inclusion to society, but also with the right to choice, it has been told, on where and with whom to live, which is a right of every human being, and builds on Article 12 as the institutionalization is one of is strictly linked with incapacitation processes and and is in contrast with the requirement of Article 12 that wishes and preference are predominant in decisions affecting the lives of persons with disabilities. The key principles of Article 19 also remind that this deinstitutionalization is for all persons with disabilities, independently from the intensity of the support they need. So if it is true that some person need more support, they should never be considered incapable, as every human being should be considered to be a never-ending potential if he or she has the support to develop this potential. So this requires to have access to a range of services and support, including support to families, as Article 7 of CRPD on children clearly refers to the CRC, to the Convention on the Rights of the Children, where it is very clearly told that a child should never be institutionalized before that the proper and sufficient support to be provided to the family to rear their children at home. So fostering inclusion and participation and preventing isolation and segregation of persons with disabilities is not for few or for the less disabled person, is really for all, and a range of solutions should be identified to allow all persons with disabilities to live in the community. The Article 19, as I told, is perfectly fit. It perfectly fits with the different degrees and levels of disabilities, as it encompasses the different kind of services, for a range of services for these persons, including accessibility and reasonable accommodation of general services, health services, for instance, education services, to provide this kind of services to all persons, all children, including those with disabilities, with the proper support and reasonable accommodation. And however, it is also included in the Article 19 the possibility to provide living arrangements, small-scale living arrangements in the community. But a lot of work has to be done, and the role of DPOs is to continue to advocate for and raising awareness on the rights-based approach to disability enshrined in the UN Convention, and in a model of services and support that is consequent with this rights-based approach, as well as combating prejudices, for instance, on intellectual and psychosocial disabilities, as these persons are the most affected by institutionalization, and on the presumed higher cost of community living. There was some years ago a EU study, EU-funded study, the clock study, that showed that it is not the size, it is the quality of the services that determines the cost of the services. So this means that we cannot allow that indiscriminate cuts go, because of the indiscriminate cuts to services, the approach to disability care goes towards bad quality services. So back in the past. So representative DPOs and users must be involved according to the participatory model of the UNCRPD in the design, implementation, and evaluation of accessibility requirements and reasonable accommodation of general services, so that the persons with disabilities, all persons with disabilities, can have access to them, to develop, adopt, and apply quality standards for services, basic quality standards of services, as for instance, habilitation services fall under the competences of the EU, the shared competence of the EU on services of general interest. So a greater efforts should be made to recommend minimum standards for services that comply with Article 19, and as well as assessment of quality services according to a person-centered approach and not a structure-oriented approach that is now currently the most used quality assessment system. Also, it is necessary to move towards the empowerment of persons with disabilities to make choices, because persons who lived for a long time in an institution may not know that there are alternatives, and may apparently choose to remain in segregated institutions, but it is because they do not have access to any other option. Again, the role of DPOs is monitoring the use of structural funds. They have been mentioned, and I have to tell that the partnership agreements in new countries not always reflect the regulation, the terms of the regulation of the EU funds, mainly, for instance, of the common provision or regulation. They are not reflected in the partnership agreements, and sometimes even the country recommendations are translated in a bad way, so that they take the opposite meaning that what it is written by the Commission. I verified that in my language. The recommendations, the country recommendations were translated and mainly in the chapter of the institutionalization with an opposite meaning. The role of DPOs is also to check the operational programs, because very often the operational programs do not comply, once again, with the EU regulations. They do not take in account the ex-ante conditionalities, and very seldom they really involve, as requested, the representative DPOs in the designing, implementation, and monitoring of the use of the funds. So more efforts are requested to the disability community to follow up at the national level all this, the use of structural funds, and more efforts to coordinate more and more in a strong unitary movement. So that, according to the UN Convention, no decision is taken on persons with disabilities and on their lives without persons with disabilities. Thank you very much.
Liels paldies, Vantī kundze.
Thank you very much. And now we see what we need to pay attention when we evaluate progress. It is now from NGOs. It is my pleasure to give the floor to Ms. Gunta Anča. In Latvia, we all know her. She's an active fighter for the rights of disabled persons. In case, since Latvia became an EU member state, Gunta has been a member of the EAESC. As now, we shall give the floor to Ms. Anča to give her opinion. Good afternoon, and thank you for this opportunity to address you. Thank you to the presidency, but I would like to say thank you to the Minister of Welfare that this theme has been chosen, and also thank you that there was a request for an opinion on deinstitutionalization to the EESC. Why is it important? It is important because we see the European context. Many presenters look at this issue from different angles. But what does it look like when we take a view of the EU? And that we can get from the following documents, although they don't seem to be very practical, but it gives you an understanding where we are and where we are going. As Ms. Jaunzeme mentioned already, a few words on this opinion. On the 25th of September last year, there was a request for this opinion. I would like to amplify that the work group that worked at this opinion included representatives from many countries: Poland, Germany, Spain, Romania, Bulgaria, Austria, Italy, Hungary, Czechia, and others. And on the 27th of March, this opinion was adopted. The 27th of May, sorry. I am not going to read it out to you. It is not necessary because each of you may turn to the homepage of EESC and read it. This is not for us here to read it out, but I would like to tell you about some of the very basic things that are very important and that have been included in this opinion. Some of the basic principles that are based on the UN Convention, CRPD. First of all, it is respect. Respect for individual autonomy and independence. Secondly, the issue in Europe that we have spoken about a lot, but we haven't done so much. That is anti-discrimination as an issue that refers to people with disabilities in all areas of life, especially when we speak about deinstitutionalization. So the question is full and effective co-participation, inclusion into the community, and accepting a person with this disability as part of the diversity we see in this world, and accessibility that allows people with disabilities to get involved in all areas of life. To continue, I would like to show what were the four most important questions that we discussed. First is very essential, DI target groups. Who are these people that we now, when we speak about DI, I'll tell you there was a great diversity of opinions. And next question was, how different would these target groups be? How diverse? Another essential point, what do we understand by the term institution? What is it? Is it a hospital or something else? And finally, DI risks. What could happen in case DI is developed in a wrong direction or in a wrong way without really understanding it? And now a bit more about target groups in DI. Here we came to the conclusion that there were three major groups that we speak about when we speak about DI. Orphan children, these are people with disabilities, and the elderly. In our work group, we had many discussions. In each country, there's a different understanding what these target groups are. In Latvia, we have a very narrow target group. We speak about people with mental disabilities. We speak about children. We do not speak about the elderly. We do not speak about people with mobility disorders. But that does not mean that these people are not a target group. But in Latvia, we haven't dealt with them as yet. When we speak about orphan children, we see that the most important aim is a family environment where they should grow up. When we speak about people with disabilities, is to gain independence. When about the elderly, we use the term integrated care, a very fashionable term, that would give the person to live an active life in the social sphere, and also that be a good care and medical assistance if needed. Each of these groups calls for very special services that are designed specially for them. Each group is very different. Now I would like to turn to people with a disability. That group is closer to me. That we also speak about in our opinion. This is not a unified group either. When I say people with disabilities, if we say that we have one service for all of them, that means that there is no service for anybody, because each has their own individual needs that depend on many things, what type of disability it is, whether they have mobility disorders, whether they have other types of disorders, and how severe the disability is, and how big is the assistance that is needed. When we speak about DI, it is important to consider the time that the person has spent in an institution. It is essential to realize it, because the person needs time to regain skills to return to society and to feel good. Very much depends on the age, at which age the person is trying to return to community. Also, rehabilitation, to what extent are we ready to provide various types of services to a person who returns to their native place? And it's important to speak about the support system. To what extent do we provide services that will make the person feel at ease and feel independent? The next big question that we spoke about in our working group, what is an institution? A perfect answer is given in the guidelines. What is an institution? First of all, we understand that the residents are isolated from the broader society, and they are compelled to live together. It doesn't matter whether you wish to live together with this person or not. This is your room, and there you have to live. Secondly, an institution means that people who live there have got sufficient control over their lives. They can't take their own decisions. There is someone who takes a decision in their stead, and they have to submit. They can take only the decisions that have been taken for them. And thirdly, each institution has their own needs, and unfortunately these needs are much more essential than the needs of the individual. That means that the institution acts to thinking about their own institutional needs, not about the people who are residents there. Now, if we pass over and to DI risks. My colleagues here mentioned a number of risks. I have here enumerated those that are included in our opinion and are really essential that we try to tackle. We had good cooperation with the European Society for the Homeless. Why? Why is this society so very much interested in our opinion? Is there any connection? And then when we worked together with them, yes, we saw it exists. Many pieces of research in Europe shows that one of the risks of DI is homelessness. Because these people need a place to live in, a place where they are used to living. And now we place this person in another place without any support, and the shortage of a systematic approach means that this person cannot really start living there, and the person finds himself or herself in the street. The second risk is inactivity. That is also essential. If a person lives alone, and when the person returns to the community, there must be support that would establish their agenda and fill a day. When some small children say, when small children say, I have nothing to do today, we know that's all right because they'll grow up and learn how to fill their day. But these people have been in an institution, everything has been regulated, set times for meals and so on, and now they are out of the system and they feel helpless. And we need to think about ways how to return to life and shape their own day themselves. Next one is loneliness. That's very important when we turn to the definition of institution. We see that people have got used to live together, whether I want it or not. I'm together with someone in the room, and they have breakfast with other people, and now they're alone. They see that they start missing something, and at this point we need to think how to shape attitudes in the community so that people should not feel lonely. They should belong to the community. And finally, that is violence. That is a problem. What happens when this person goes out into the community? Is the community ready to accept the person as equal? Aren't there some problems? Don't we have to think about ways how to improve the situation? Of course, in their opinion, we couldn't give concrete answers to all these issues, but we could give some directions how these may be solved. And one is timely rehabilitation. That means that the person is provided with a possibility to return to the community in good time, and they start preparing for it. Tailor-made services that are based in the community, not a big group, but smaller groups for each group, even each individual. And finally, that is no less important, is a positive attitude of the society. A positive attitude means that the society, the community is ready to accept this person. It's easy just to jot down these points, but it's much more complicated to get them implemented. I believe that we have concrete aims and we have understandable tasks. We can also shape the steps how to reach these aims. That much briefly about this opinion that was prepared by the EESC, where I was also a rapporteur. And here in the final, you see a puppet, and here we are the scissors that are cutting off these strings so that the person would be able to move around independently and not be jugged about. Thank you very much.
Paldies, Ančas kundzei.
Thank you, Ms. Anča. I would like to say that this opinion also shows how the importance of EU consultative institutions, including the committee working on economic and social issues. This institution is able to assess from various assess problems from various aspects. Thank you for the input. I think it will be very useful for our further work. The next speaker will be Director of the Department of Social Services at the Ministry of Welfare of Latvia, Danute Jasko. She has a lot of experience in the field, and she has taken a fresh approach here in this presentation. And as we see, we have been looking for solutions for quite some time, and while nobody has found the solution, she would like to talk about the vision of Latvia on possible solutions. Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, I have a great honor to participate at this conference today, a conference that is represented by almost all European countries, and I would like to share the Latvian experience in the process of DI. I would like to touch upon the main issues concerning the DI process in Latvia, the main principles we are pursuing when implementing the DI mechanism, as well as the priorities set in the field, which are changing, the same as our life and our opinions. The DI process, in my opinion, started in 2013, at the end of the year, when the Cabinet of Ministers adopted the basic stance on the development of social services. The priorities has been marked on the screen. The priorities set in these guidelines. But basically, they are they concern the same idea. It's about society-based services. Thus far, we have been assessing the DI process not in a very careful manner, and there are concerns that we might have difficulties with the process implementation. The question is, what happens if these people leave these institutions on the same day? How are we going to solve this problem if it happens? But the DI process is not about closing the institutions as mentioned by my colleague, and not even so much about providing the possibility to leave the institutions for their current residents. The DI process is actually about increasing the quality of the services and the quality of life, as well as the development of community-based services. And in the third place is the possibility for those people who live at these institutions to live independently. Speaking about the priorities, of course, the DI process marks new priorities for the whole Latvian social policy, also the policy concerning disability. The main point is that these services should be targeted, the attention should be paid to human rights and giving people the possibility to socialize instead of thinking about what kind of services they're going to receive. The next point, speaking about the services, then we have to speak about the whole spectrum of services. We need to start providing community-based services instead of institutionalized services. Speaking about people's disabilities, we need to understand that we have been paying too much attention to the issue of disability. We should step aside and look at people's functional abilities and at the ability to take care of themselves. The DI also means new priorities concerning people, a person-based approach, and here the needs of each individual are in the center. And speaking about the provision of community-based services in the future, we need to base them on individual needs of all people. And instead of creating some infrastructure and thinking later how it could be adopted, we should first think about the people. And the person-based approach is very important. We should not be thinking about the inability of people, but about individuals, about some individual inabilities to take care of themselves. Speaking about the principles applied also by the welfare ministry when working out the DI mechanism, the first and the most important principle is the involvement of municipalities in the DI process. Here you see the Latvian administrative map. It is quite colorful. Here you see 119 municipalities. Each municipality has a social service that provides services to people with disabilities. If we want to provide community-based services to all individuals in all Latvia, the optimal model would be to involve the 119 municipalities. But I must admit that municipalities are different, and their abilities to finance these services are different as well. The number of individuals in these municipalities is different. Thus, of course, municipalities have to cooperate among themselves. It is important to regionally coordinate their action in the DI process. And the next point to which we have come is the idea that the control could be done via planning regions. What are the DI target groups in the planning for which we would provide quality community-based services? It is important to focus on particular target groups, and for Latvia, this choice has been made. The first group is adults with mental disabilities who live both in institutions and among the society. It is also important to take care of children in out of familiar care. The sooner we provide the assistance, the possibility to live in a family environment for these children, the sooner and in a more successful way the child's development will start. The third group we're going to work with is children with disabilities. They live already among the community, but due to certain reasons, they are not receiving the services they need. Speaking about the results we would like to achieve in Latvia by the end of 2020, with the help of the structural funds, these objectives are also linked to the groups mentioned. By 2020, a part of people could start living independent life outside the institution. 1,040 people approximately. We want to provide for them services in their place of residence. We need to think about providing the whole spectrum of services, and it includes social services and general services as well. Certain institutions will be closed, and the number of places will be reduced in these institutions. Speaking about children, we have planned that the number of children will be reduced to about 60% in the age group of 3 to 6 months. We are planning to provide to 3,000 children services at their place of residence. An important principle in the formation of the policy is the fact that we cannot only think about providing social services, because it is important to include the people in the community, and they need to provide such general services as education, employment, and housing, as well as healthcare and transport. Speaking about the current situation that we have now, Latvia has about 8,000 children with functional disabilities, and we're planning that in the result of the DI process, 3,400 children will be provided with various services. Speaking about the children that are living now in institutions, the institutions in Latvia are of various size. 12 of them are quite large, hosting more than 51 child. Looking at the services that are available to these children now, 5,000 children are staying with guardians. 16,000 children are staying in foster families, and 1,700 are residing in institutions. The main principle for us would be to provide for these children family-based services. And you can see in the graph that according to the data concerning disease, you see the number of these people affected by this problem. Only 6% of people live in institutions. If we compare all these numbers, then it seems that we are trying to make only the first steps to provide individualized quality services for these people. The DI process itself is taking place already now, considering the trend that people are leaving institutions. Last year, about 70 people had the possibility to leave institutions and to start living in families or start using housing services. Regardless of whether we want it, the process has already started. Our main objective is to make this process civilized. If we take a look at the development of institutionalized services, we may see that the share of community-based services is not big. Therefore, it is important to use EU support to develop these services. The number of people in institutions is becoming lower, but at the same time, there is a line of people waiting for these services, and this line is growing. This may be explained by the fact that there are no serious alternatives. alternatives for community-based services in the people's place of residence. The DI process is aimed at providing community-based services to people. The DI process has been planned in several directions, but the main principle that we have tried to elaborate into these mechanisms is individual needs of persons. The start of the Latvian DI process has been the assessment of people's needs residing in institutions or among the community. 5 regions will be responsible for further development of the DI plan. And along the elaboration of this plan, specialist experts will be trained. And here we're talking about specialists working in special services, experts who are already involved in the provision of services, also institutional services.
Together with elaboration of plans for DI, we shall have the real process going on to improve the infrastructure and also monitor and assess the DI process. Now, a cooperation model for DI among stakeholders. Here you see in the slide the main DI coordinators are the planning regions. They have to work together with local governments to work a detailed DI plan in cooperation with NGOs to provide the services that are necessary for those who live in the community or those who will be living to start an independent life. That's why it'd be very important for all the interested parties to work together. Now, when we speak about some challenges, here I could say mainly that is a very unequal, ambiguous attitude from the society towards DI. So a number of measures have been taken to gradually change the attitude of the society to the DI process. It's important to see to it that the local government is more involved in the process. It's important to come to terms with all the interested parties that in the center we have the needs of the people, and everything should be based on the needs of the people, and all the steps that we take proceed from here to improve the infrastructure. And now it is real time to start working together for all of us to implement the DI process in a successful way. And now I would like to say that I really do hope when we speak about the DI mechanism and the opportunities and the challenges, I hope that in a few years when we have another international conference, Latvia will be proud not only to introduce their own ideas how to implement, but also speak about very concrete results. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. We are lagging a little bit behind, but the subject matter is really interested, and I hope that we can sacrifice something from our coffee break to listen to Mr. Kirsten Sandberg, professor of Oslo University, who is representative of the Children's Rights Bureau of the UN.
Dear all, thank you so much for inviting me to this very important event. Thank you to the Latvian Presidency for organizing it. I think I should say that what I'm a member of is the United Nations Committee on the Rights of the Child, which is monitoring the implementation of the Convention on the Rights of the Child in all countries around the world. Today I'm going to talk about result-oriented social policy reform. And I think we've gone through all of these stages already, through all the speeches by the other speakers, but now I'm going to look at it at a kind of the principal stage of looking at these different stages that you have to go through when you plan and implement a policy reform. And there are four main stages, four main activities that you have to do when you try to make a policy reform. First, you need to do the mapping. You have to look at what is the present situation. Then you have to find out what are the results you want to obtain. Then you look at the measures, how you would get to this result. And finally, you have to have an idea about how you're going to monitor the results. And I'm going to talk about these four stages. So first, to the mapping. So that is about where are we today? What is the present situation? How many people is it about? Who are they? Where are they at the moment? What needs do they have? What are the root causes that we are in the present situation? For instance, with a large number of people in institutions, but also a large number of people with disabilities living at home without the proper services. So there needs to be data collection and analysis of the data, and these data need to be disaggregated so that you can put it into different categories by gender, age, geographic location, type of institution that people are in, the reason for being there, any special needs. Of course, you need to divide into these groups. For instance, in Latvia, where you have children in institutions, you have persons with disabilities, and you have children with disabilities living at home. And the elderly was mentioned as a group earlier today. So all of these different types and groups have to be put into statistical analysis before you start your work at all. That is something we see in the Committee on the Rights of the Child, that many countries, or even most countries, I would say, do not have proper data collection systems, and so it's very hard for themselves to know actually what they are doing, and for our committee in Geneva to see what they are doing. You also need qualitative analysis. How is people's life today? What do they want? What are their needs? I just have to do this at a very kind of principle level. I can't go into detail, as you know, about the time here. So then you have to find out what result you want. So this is not the result you have reached yet. This is putting out the result you want to reach. So how you view it in advance. What do you want to obtain? So you have to put up the overall goal of the whole reform. You have to specify it a bit more into the objectives, and then you have to set out the time-bound targets within each of the objectives, and you need to use indicators to see how this is going to function. So I'll look a bit at each of those. So we've already heard quite a lot about the overall goals that you might want to reach. That would be today, we would say it would be to fulfill human rights, and it has been like that for a long time, at least talking about children since 1989, as was mentioned, and with the CRPD since 2006, is that when the convention? Yeah. So fulfilling the human rights, I won't go into detail, but it has to do with the dignity, autonomy, equality of opportunities, etc., as we've heard before. But it also has to do definitely with giving people a better life. When it comes to deinstitutionalization, a bit more particularly, the objectives would be the right to a home, or for a child to live in a family. Another important objective is inclusion in society and self-determination as far as possible. In Norway, we had a very important reform in 1991 regarding the deinstitutionalization of persons with mental disabilities. There were 5,300 people in institutions for persons with mental disabilities, and they were all to go out of the institutions, and there were also, I think, between 15,000 and 20,000 mentally disabled people living at home, who were also part of the reform. So the objectives were to give people, or let them have a home of their own, that they should participate in cultural and leisure time activities. They should have the same access to health services as they already had in institutions. And they should get what we called at that time normal living conditions. So at that time, 25 years ago, normalization was a goal of this reform. We wouldn't use that word anymore. We would use inclusion. We don't talk about things being normal or not normal in this respect. So there were more objectives of this reform as well, but I'm going to follow these 4 objectives. Today we would talk about, as I said, inclusion and also independent living for the bottom one. Then one needs to go a bit closer into what one wants to do, to set time-bound targets, to find out exactly what you want in each of these, under each of these objectives. And there is a necessity to use indicators, and we heard that there is work going on with the developing indicators, and that happens in a lot of areas within human rights, and they are very useful when it comes to finding out exactly what you have to do and how to measure it afterwards. So if you want to have people out of institutions, you have to look again at how many and when do you want to do it, and all the different things we've looked at before, the needs and so on. And of course, what do you put instead? You cannot just decide, as we've also heard, that you want to move people out of institutions. You need to move them somewhere, or they need to get a place to live instead of the institutions. So there must be good alternatives. For children, the alternative would be family-based care. For adults, it would be to have a home of one's own, or as a part of a bigger community home, a group home. Then there's the other side of this. One thing is to get people out of institutions. The other one is preventing the people who are not yet into institutions from getting into institutions. And that is the issue of, on one hand, prevention, all the things you need to do to prevent people to get into institutions. I'm going to look more at the measures afterwards. But also it's about gatekeeping, which I would call, as a lawyer, that would be more of the legal requirements for letting people into institutions, and they have to be strict so that they don't move into institutions, those who are not there already. And you have to look at, do you want to reduce the number all the way to 0, or do you want to reduce it by, for instance, 60%, as we heard during a specific period for children in institutions in Latvia? And when, by what time do you want to do this? I can see that many of these things have already been done in Latvia in the way you're planning your reform. Then what do you put instead? Then I'm talking about those who are not yet into institutions. So then for the child, the alternative would be mainly to stay where the child is if he or she lives with his or her family. Or to come back to the family if he or she doesn't live in an institution, but somewhere. And for an adult with disabilities, it might be that he or she stays at home at the moment, and that might be a good thing, that he stays at home wherever that might be. With the family might be okay, but it might also be an idea for the adult to move to a home of his or her own, to a group home, and for the child it might be family-based care, that the child actually moves out of the family but not into an institution, but if you need to move the child out of his or her family, but not into an institution, then you have to provide family-based care. In Norway, what I call the HVPU reform, this is the Norwegian abbreviation, we are so used to it, but it's for mental disability, persons with mental disabilities to not be institutionalized. So when you need to set targets, you need to do it for all the objectives. And I think in Norway we were very occupied with giving people a home of their own. But it's not enough to put the targets under that objective. You also need to put targets more specifically for participation in leisure time activities and culture activities. And you have to have targets and indicators for giving people the same access to health services as before, and also for this normal living conditions, or the independent living, as we would say today. Then you need to do impact assessment, which has also been mentioned before. You need to assess the impact of the present situation if it continues as before. You need to assess the impact of the different alternative measures that you can use to reach the targets. And you have to assess the impact of what will be obtained and what are the costs of the different possible ways to get there. So then we'll look at the measures more closely. So I would divide them into individual measures and structural measures. The individual measures, that would be to decide to close the institutions within a certain time limit. Well, it sounds more like a structural measure, but it means, what I mean by putting it here is that all persons living in institutions would be offered, or have to, that depends on what you decide, to move out of the institutions within a certain time limit. That is a possibility, to put that as the main goal. In Norway, we did that with the time limit starting from the whole reform started the 1st of January 1991. And the final time frame of abolishing all the institutions was 31st of December 1995, so that would give them 5 years. But the recommended time was actually the 1st of January 1994, so that would only give them 91, 92, 93, 3 years to do it. But it was a bit flexible. But that was actually a decision that was made to start off with. That is what we want, that is our goal, our target, is to close the institutions. And we have to then make that decision. And then provide the alternatives to institutions. As I mentioned before, for children it would be to provide family-based care. That could be to live with his or her parents. It could be kinship care. It could be to move into a foster family, into an SOS children's village, or other possibilities that are similar to living in a family, or could be called family-based. For adults, it would be to have a home of one's own, or a group home, as mentioned before. Then, of course, other individual measures would be to give financial support to the individual to be able to live like that. You need community services, as we've heard before. Training to the individual. For parents, that would be to train them in positive parenting, how to take care of a child, which is not so easy always. And for adults, it might be to be trained in activities of daily life and other kinds of training which is needed, of course, physiotherapy and things like that as well. Then measures have to be set also for the targets under other objectives, like I said, under participation in cultural activities, and also for the healthcare that should function then, because an important part of this reform in Norway, as in Latvia, is that you transfer the responsibility to the municipalities, because people have to move into a municipality that has quite a bit of self-autonomy, the municipalities, so they would have to cooperate strongly on all this. But you would have to set the measures for all these other targets as well. You need to provide social protection at a general level, and that is poverty alleviation. Poverty, as we always say in the Committee on the Rights of the Child, and we've already heard today, should never be a reason for putting a child into an institution. And if it has been a reason why the child is already there, you need to provide social protection so that parents can take them back into the family. And that would mainly be when I talk about that, it would mainly be in financial support to families, but also social protection for persons with disabilities moving out of institutions. Mainstream services like education and health have to be made available and accessible to all who need them when they move out of institutions. The structural measures, I could talk a long time about those, I won't, I'll just mention them. You need a legal framework, really. This need to be put into law, not least when it comes to the gatekeeping for placing persons in institutions, as I said before, but also the minimum standards for the services when they are to be provided by the municipalities. And also the procedural issues have to be regulated by law. We are here talking about policy reform. You need to make strategies, you need to make action plans where you put all the objectives, the targets, the indicators and all the specific measures that you want to use. They would go into the action plans that were made in the municipalities in Norway. The responsibility needs to be clearly allocated, who is going to do what, and there needs to be coordination between all the different sectors. It has to be cross-sectorial. We know that it has to do with health, it has to do with social development, it has to do with children. All of these have to be coordinated across. And that is really what a lot of countries, or most states, I would say, have a problem with, this cross-coordination. But there is also the coordination between the national level and the regional and local levels, where you've also described what you do in Latvia. Yes, the county governor was sort of in between in Norway. We have 20 counties, we have 430 municipalities, and they had to be in on this, at least the municipalities where the persons with disabilities, mental disabilities, would move. You need allocation of resources, both at the national level and at the local level. You need to train social workers and other professionals at the local level. And there needs not least to be awareness raising of the population. We've heard that the NGOs do quite a lot of that, but it's also important that the state takes a responsibility for this, the attitudes that people have to persons with disabilities. And there needs to be some kind of complaints mechanism for the persons that move out of institutions and into the municipality if they don't get what they were supposed to get. Then the final stage, which is the monitoring. So then you look at what are the results that you have obtained. You need then to have a short-term assessment of indicators and targets according to the set time frame. The Norwegian municipalities had to report to the county governor every 3 months about what they had achieved. And there needs also to be a more long-term evaluation of the objectives or the results compared with the objectives. And of course then you need to adjust the measures if this doesn't happen as it was supposed to do. Then what happened in Norway, it was looked at 10 years after, in 2001, this HVPU reform for people with mental disabilities. To the first objective, that they should have a house or a home of their own. Yes, all of these 5,300 people had actually been moved or had moved out of institutions because it was voluntary whether they wanted to do it or not. But they did get a lot of support to do it. So all of them had moved into the local communities, and they did have a home of their own, but there were some collective features to those homes. When it comes to culture and leisure activities, that was rather segregated. Norway had not managed to reach the objective of actually including people with mental disabilities in what all other people were doing in their leisure time. So maybe that had to do with the targets not being clear enough, the indicators not being there, maybe not enough measures had been put in place in order to reach this target. This was more up to maybe the private initiative, which might not have been such a good idea. Then when it came to access to healthcare, that had been somewhat reduced compared with what they got when they were in the institutions. That might also have to do with this not being set out so clearly as the main target, that was to close the institutions and have them move out. When it comes to having so-called normal living conditions or independent living in the way they wanted it, we had mixed answers. 56% said they had too much communal life because most of these homes were connected in some way, and they had meals together, they had a common living room with a TV and so on, and many of them said that they were together with people, they had to be together with people that they had not chosen. So this is for the goal of independency. But on the other hand, 44% were pleased. Family members were very negative to this reform in advance, but afterwards 73 of them were positive. So all in all, it seems to have been quite a successful reform, however, with some things that could have been improved. And it's also been looked at later stages, and it seems there is a tendency now that somebody mentioned here before that large institutions, they were not really large in Norway, but at least that they see now somewhat larger institutions again, or more institution-like ways of living. So this is something that has to be debated further in Norway. Thank you very much for your attention.
Liels paldies Sandbergas kundzei par dalīšanos ar pieredzi Norvēģijā, kā redzam.
Thank you for sharing the Norwegian experience, which you started the process at the time when Latvia took its space for independence. I must say that this is an inspiring example, and we can continue learning together. Now I have the pleasure to introduce you to the next session before we go to the coffee break. I suggest that we postpone lunch for 13:45. Let us have a coffee break now and come back at after 20 minutes. I think it will be enough. And after that, we will have a little bit more time. I'm already looking at the next moderator, Ieva, who will host you here after 20 minutes. Thank you.